Hello, if you liked my story, don't forget to like, comment, share. This story belongs to Onur Diler's Tales of the Forbidden City concept. In this concept, there is a timeline and all the stories are connected to it. Chapter 5. August 2nd, Manhattan, New York, USA. Play nice and don't show your tracks. McCrollins was sitting in his chair. He turned his back to Bakesfield, who had entered the room, and looked boredly out the window of his study at the view of New York, and asked, "What happened in London?" "We set up a surveillance team as you requested," Bakesfield said with something approaching a smile, then added, "Then our assault team entered the house as you ordered," he said, describing the events in London. McCrollins raised one eyebrow and turned quickly around. "Assault team?" "I said no murder." Bakesfield looked at McCrollins in surprise and said, "What, that wasn't your order?" "That's impossible. I didn't send the assault team either." "What does this mean?" asked McCrollins, turning toward Bakesfield. There were very few people in the company with the authority to give orders to the strike teams. Bakesfield looked ahead thoughtfully, scratching his chin. "I don't know, but this is getting complicated. The assault team and the surveillance team were wiped out. Two of the surveillance team are alive. Catherine Wilspel is missing, we think she fled in terror. The other is in intensive care, and he told one of our men that her attacker was a blonde woman wielding a samurai sword," Bakesfield said. He knew the effect this description would have on McCrollins. The person he was describing was an assassin known as Dark Shadow, a longtime blacksmith. McCrollins half rose from his chair in anger. "Did our man shoot us?" he asked. Bakesfield shook his head slightly, his expression sad. "I'm afraid so, sir. That's not our only problem. After this incident, I learned that there was talk of a group called the White Daggers," he said in a low voice, as if he were telling a secret. McCrollins seemed to have gotten his anger under control. He straightened up, straightened his wrinkled jacket, pulled himself together, and headed to the left. He opened an American bar cleverly hidden in the wall, took out 2 crystal glasses and a crystal brandy bottle, and asked, "Wizards?" "No, alas, the Blackmen. They were led by a man nicknamed the Cloak," Bakesfield said. Pausing, McCrollins poured some brandy into the glasses and handed them to Bakesfield, asking, "What's the matter?" This was the first time Bakesfield could remember offering him a drink. "Traditionalists. They believe that black men should belong only to the Vatican," Bakesfield said, picking up the glass and staring absently into the drink. "This is bullshit," McCrollins said with a sneer. Throughout history, there had been occasional betrayals and rebellions among the black men, but none had been of great success. "Yes, but that's the way it is, and I believe they stole the Twins of Destiny," Bakesfield said with a shrug. "Did you identify them?" asked McCrollins, grumbling and taking a long sip of his drink. Bakesfield shook his head and said, "Not yet. I'm looking into it." "Give it your full attention and focus," McCrollins said with a frown, his voice approaching military discipline. Bakesfield said, "Of course, sir," and returned to his room without rushing. He took the battery out of his cell phone and put it back in. He plugged the connection cable into the computer before turning on his phone. Bakesfield turned on his phone and the warning lights on his computer started to flash. His phone was tapped. When the phone rang for a long time and answered, he said in a rushed but sincere tone, "It's me, Otto." Otto had known Bakesfield for a long time. He could tell by the tone of his voice that something was wrong. "What's going on?" he asked. Bakesfield remained friendly and said, "I don't know, but McCrollins got a warrant out on you. All the black men are looking for you and your grandchildren." "But why?" Otto asked curiously. "Something happened at their grandson's house in London. A raid and surveillance team was wiped out," Bakesfield said. Otto's voice on the phone rose in surprise. "What was destroyed?" Otto said in a serious tone. "You don't know where your grandchildren are, do you?" Bakesfield said pointedly. "Of course I don't," Otto said flatly. "Where are you?" Bakesfield asked, his eyes narrowed and his smile half smiled. "Norway," Otto said in a casual tone. Bakesfield looked at the map on his laptop and smiled, a red light indicating Turkey. August 2nd, Thornwood, New York, USA. Walking down the corridor on the dormitory floor where the student rooms were located, Anton had his hands in his pockets with Henry Gerard. The young man walked with a careless attitude, his back hunched over from fatigue. He had a standard canvas bag that they used for camping. This morning, Jun Sung had survival lessons, and they had only returned from the lessons just before dinner. It seemed to Anton that Mr. Sung never got tired. This thought made him even more tired. Shaking his head, he asked Henry, "Which one will you choose?" When Henry frowned and looked at him with a questioning look, he said, "The selection time is approaching." Every student at the foundation took the selection exams for the campus they were studying at after they turned 15. These exams tested their physical limits, their knowledge, and their psychology. At the end of these exams, the students were sent to the Rainbow Campus in the center of New York, or the Earth Campus, which was far from the city center, like the Blue Campus they were currently studying at. Anton had come to the Blue Campus 5 years ago from the Water Campus. When the campus was burned down in a massive fire, Anton and the few surviving students were dispersed to other campuses by the Foundation. Anton never spoke about it, and if the subject was brought up, he would remain silent or close the subject. Henry shrugged and said, "I don't think we have a say in this matter. They will place us according to our scores. After all, we don't have the same qualifications as you. I'm about to fail all my physical classes. Your basic sciences are also pretty much terrible." While Anton paused for a moment and looked across, and Henry curiously said, "What?" When he looked across, he saw Eric coming out of his room with his bags and boxes. Next to him stood the headmaster, Mr. White, and the new student who had arrived the other day. "Damn it," Anton muttered as he walked towards his room. "I don't understand," Anton said after a few minutes, looking at the headmaster, Mr. William White, with one raised eyebrow and a stern expression. "Your roommate is changing, Mr. Leshrak," said Mr. White, who did not seem to mind very much. "You should have asked us that, Mr. White," Anton said with clearly controlled anger. "Unfortunately, we have no other choice in our situation, Mr. Leshrak," said the director with a smile that was a cold imitation of sincerity. Then he started down the corridor, taking Eric with him. Not liking the situation very much either, Scott held out his hand and said, "Scott Donovan," but Anton shook his head and left Scott's hand in the air and walked into his room. He was roommates with Eric for 5 years. "He's a really good kid. I'm Henry, by the way," Henry said, patting Scott on the shoulder and shaking the upturned hand. Henry Gerard. August 2nd, Athens, Greece. Clytemnestra and her men had taken their silenced tank M416S. The weapons were equipped with LED target lights and green lasers that could be seen through night vision equipment. The 8-man team was loaded into 2 Ford Transits, each with 2 teams of 4. All the men were trusted men Clytemnestra had worked with before. They were all wearing Kevlar vests and full equipment. The men, wearing their operational helmets, waited silently for the vehicles to approach. "We're getting closer," Clytemnestra said, touching the intercom around her neck as she approached the street. At that, the team lowered their night vision equipment to their eyes and activated them, while Christos and Nestor unclipped their weapons. At 4 in the morning, the only barking in the neighborhood where the villa was located was the street dogs. The moon had just set and the air was cool for August. The guards on the front gate were large men. They wore summery, light fabric suits. The guards, their arms leaning on their short-strap MP5s, chatted in hushed tones and smoked cigarettes. "Now," Clytemnestra said on her radio as 2 vehicles turned onto the street. The G3 bullet entered the spine of the first guard at the front and exited, making a hole the size of a euro coin, and knocked the other man down with an equally large hole. After both men fell with a single shot, the minibuses stopped silently in front of the villa and their doors opened. The first men to get out of the car fired a shot into the heads of the fallen guards to make sure they were dead. At this point Nestor said, "I'm going in through the back door." Christos would remain in his position until the group left the villa. Entering through the iron gate, the team quickly moved towards the main building. The second man of the team who reached the main gate silenced the security system in less than half a minute. Apparently, no one was checking the security cameras. The house was in the silence of sleep. Metaxas had thought of every luxury for his own house. The floor of the house with high ceilings was made of well-varnished wood. Opposite the main hall where the assault team entered, there were stairs leading to the upper floor. The steps of the marble stairs were dimly lit with LED lights. With the dim yellow light, only the outlines of the stairs were visible, making it easier to go up and down the stairs in the dark. The walls covered with expensive wallpaper were adorned with works by the most famous painters of Greece. There were 3 entrances to the hall. On the left was the corridor leading to the kitchen, pantry, toilet and servants' rooms. The middle door led to a short corridor leading to 2 stories and the pool, and on the right was the hall that occupied half of the lower floor. Clytemnestra divided her group into 2 with hand signals. The 3 men headed towards the left corridor. Their primary targets were security personnel and the computers recording the cameras. The men, their weapons resting on their shoulders, disappeared silently into the darkness. Clytemnestra and her team of 3 headed upstairs. They had left 1 man at the entrance just in case. Like the others, they hunched over and rested their weapons on their shoulders. Reaching the middle of the stairs, Clytemnestra heard metallic sounds from the left hallway and stopped. Everyone knew that this sound, barely audible despite the silence of the house, was from a silenced gun. Immediately after the sound, a bass baritone voice said over the closed-circuit radio, "Contact, clear." Clytemnestra released the breath she had been holding and signaled her team to advance. The group in the left corridor was walking along a dark corridor, about 2 meters wide, hung with various black and white photographs. The man at the head of the group was Malik, one of Clytemnestra's most trusted men. The Egyptian man was in his 40s. The man with gray and bushy hair had been rumored to have been trained by the Mossad. But these were all rumors. The man with the stubble and broad, angular face had not been trained by the Mossad, but he was so good that the rumors made perfect sense when you got to know him. The dark corridor was illuminated by the opening of the kitchen door about 5 minutes away, and a guard emerged from the kitchen with a coffee mug in his hand. Before the other men could even raise their rifles, Malik dropped his rifle and threw a throwing knife he had hung in a special sheath behind his waist. The knife made a faint whistle in the corridor and buried itself in the throat of the guard who had not even seen his enemy. The man opened his mouth in panic, but was knocked to the ground by 2 bullets that hit his chest and 1 in his head. The assault team in the corridor looked at Malik, who was holding his silenced pistol in his hand, in astonishment. As I said, it was completely fabricated that Malik had been trained by the Mossad. Malik al-Tanfaz had been training the Mossad for a long time. "Contact, clear," the man said, touching his radio emotionlessly. At the end of the stairs, Clytemnestra, who checked her right first, pointed to her team on the left. The floor on this floor was carpeted. The team, who passed the first 2 doors, stopped at the 3rd door. She opened the door slowly and lightly and checked inside. The room, which was the size of a normal living room, was Metaxas' bedroom. Clytemnestra, who signaled to her other men, entered. The magnificent and gold-leafed curtains were closed. Metaxas and his wife Alexa were lying on a large, double bed in the bedroom with antique furniture. After the 4 men who surrounded them with the silence of a cat took their places, the 2 near the head took packages that looked like bandages from their pockets and silently pressed the open cloths to the victims' mouths. They were holding their heads with their other hands so that they could not escape. At the same time, 2 men grabbed Metaxas and Alexa's hands. When the couple, who resisted for a short time, finally stopped moving, black bags were immediately put on their heads and their hands were tied with plastic cable cuffs, then they were lifted out of the bed. Meanwhile, the team leader of the lower floor, Malik, said, "The lower floor is clear." The 2 groups had met on the lower level, and Clytemnestra glanced briefly at the unconscious couple they had brought downstairs before saying, "Take the children." This caused a few glances at each other, but Malik shrugged and signaled for his team to head upstairs. This was a war, and it would be won with brutality. Metaxas was a chubby man in his late 40s, 5 feet tall, 80 kilos, with a chubby face. His hair had fallen out about 20 years ago. The man was obsessed with the subject and had had a hair transplant about 10 years ago. His hair, which was now 2 fingers long, was in disarray. The businessman with thick eyebrows and a tiny dimpled chin woke up when a bucket of cold water hit his face. When his green eyes, which he opened in a daze, were dazzled by the light, his pupils had shrunk to the size of pinheads. The halogen lamp pointed at his face stabbed his brain with daggers of pain, and he realized that he was tied to a chair with armrests with durable plastic clamps used to attach cables. He looked around in panic. The first thing he saw was bare concrete floor. He must have been underground. The air was damp and cool. A few meters in front of him was a chair and a coffee table. On the table were about 20 syringes containing yellow, about 20 red, and a few transparent liquids. Even though he could barely see through the light, he could barely make out the presence of 2 guards. He wanted to speak, but there was tape over his mouth. The guards stood in front of a white shower curtain, smoking cigarettes. When one of them noticed him moving, he called out to someone behind the light in a language that resembled Arabic. A short while later, a man came to the light and sat down in the chair in front of it. The man crossed his legs and lit a cigarette in his vest with plenty of pockets. He took a deep breath, then looked at Metaxias and said, "Hello, my friend. I'm sorry to bring you here like this, but I need information from you." His voice was sincere, even friendly. "You will tell me everything because I will force you to tell me," he continued, as if he were talking with sorrow. "We can keep people awake for days because of this. Your head feels like a potato, believe me. We give you a sleeping pill in one arm and a stimulant in the other arm when you fall asleep. Look, it's interesting. Every time, it's like you're on a roller coaster. You know, those big, fast trains you find in amusement parks. But of course, it's not that fun after the 20th injection. You know. You just want it to be over. Then there are those who like classical things inside. They will put you on that metal table over there and electrocute you. They need information from you, you know, they need that information from you, and those guys who don't like to go home late, they will do it without thinking twice. Sometimes when you give too much electricity, your teeth break, I think from clenching. But I don't think it's civilized, and it's risky. I prefer water and a towel. You put a towel on your face first and start pouring water from a bucket. You feel like you're drowning. It's really disgusting, but it works. My really patient friends use heroin or sodium pentothal, but I'm not patient," he said, then he signaled to the big men behind him to open the curtained area. Metaxas' eyes widened. His wife and 2 daughters were behind the curtain. "The most important thing," said Giagoras Clytemnestra, shaking off her easy and sweet demeanor a moment ago, in an icy voice, "we're not going to do these things to you, we're going to do them and you're going to watch." The man shook his head helplessly and panicked. Sweat beads had formed on his face. The smiling man reached up from his chair and pulled the tape off Metaxas' mouth. The man said in one breath, "I'll tell you whatever you want. They're not at fault, and I'm not at fault either. I was just a contractor. I did the projects that were given to me. That's all, I swear." "Good, I knew we would get along," Clytemnestra said with a smile. August 2, Langley, Virginia, USA. Knox's blood pressure would rarely rise. When this happened, his carotid artery would become prominent. His heartbeat would become strong enough to feel the pulse in his neck and temple. Just like now. The traces in most of the reports that came had taken them almost all over the world and then returned to CIA headquarters. Middle East City Thomas Hartman's assistant Carl Taylor was the person who had recruited Polanov to the CIA. Carl had also issued a surveillance order for the scientists who had gone on vacation, and had put them on a large list. The list was called the Oasis Project. But the content and general information of this project had been erased from the main files. Moreover, there was another red flag next to King Taylor's name. According to this, he had conducted an operation in Azerbaijan in which Delta Force participated. In this operation called Red Fox, nuclear warhead materials were smuggled from the collapsed Soviet Russia, but they were lost on the way. Then the Deltas also disappeared. According to the records, Taylor was working in Block B. "I don't think the guy's that stupid," Knox said to Ferguson, who was looking at him with raised eyebrows as he took his gun from his drawer, and he put the gun behind his waist. Ferguson prepared to follow him as he took his jacket from the hanger. Ferguson and Knox went to Block B, but when they entered room 332, they encountered a nasty surprise. The room was empty. Moreover, when Ferguson looked around the room a little, they realized that the room had been empty for almost years. That's why the duo went straight to Brooke Hall. Hall, like them, had not left the building during the operation. Hall was on the phone when they entered his room. While giving someone the operation instructions in Spanish, he saw the duo and signaled with his finger that he wanted some time. He had indeed turned his phone off less than a minute later. After listening to Knox and Ferguson, he grumbled and looked at his computer from his desk. "Carl Taylor," he said. Then, he paused. Carl Taylor, Carl Taylor. That name sounds familiar to me," and started fiddling with his computer. Carl Taylor, born July 14, 1980, Wisconsin, studied at UCLA, joined the CIA in 2005, died of a heart attack in 2022, he said, scratching his head. "Get the hell out of there," Ferguson said. "There's a record of the guy working in B Block." "What kind of filth is this?" Brooke hissed, looking at the computer. "And who runs the damn shell company?" Knox cursed. Brooke continued to look through the files. After 3 or 4 minutes, he said, "The company for the operation was set up by Bana-X. Ban-X was a famous bank of American origin. Its owner had supported many CIA operations." "Who owns that company?" Ferguson asked, his eyes narrowing. "Nisco Oil," Brooke said, clicking a few more buttons. Ferguson and Knox looked at each other, and Brooke grinned. "Lucky for us, I know someone at the oil giant who can help us." Knox and Ferguson had returned to their own block. "I was hoping for a fight," Knox grumbled before the elevator doors opened. Ferguson, laughing at the man who rarely cracked a joke, realized that Knox was serious. This had sparked many thoughts about Knox in his mind. They had been inexperienced together, and when Knox was badly wounded in an attack, he had been brought to the center. He had never been the same since that injury. But Ferguson had just realized that this change was not just a calming down. Despite the loss of many limbs and organs, Knox continued to work for the CIA. In fact, it sometimes seemed as if he was just working. He worked himself to death, without rest or respite. Now Ferguson realized that the man had actually hoped to die. When the elevator doors opened with a metallic chime, they were met by 2 guards walking down the hallway. Both were wearing the standard black side-pocketed slacks and black shirts, boots, and caps of CIA internal security. They were carrying Glock 21s and MP5s on their hips. "Good evening," the security guard said as he saw the 2 exit the elevator. "Good evening, Frank." Ferguson and Knox sat at the same time to the 40-year-old guard and continued down the hallway. "What do we do now?" Ferguson asked, looking annoyed by what he had just discovered about Knox. The Japanese had taken the U.S. Navy by surprise at Pearl Harbor and rendered half of it useless. On September 11, the half-witted jihadists they had trained to stop the Russians in Afghanistan had destroyed half their economy. Now a crazy Serb had kidnapped one of the world's top microbiologists, a group of mercenaries had seized the raw materials for nuclear warheads, and they were both inside America. Each of them was powerful enough to destroy not half of something, but the whole thing. "We'll fight," Knox said, hands in his pockets. He walked with his shoulders slumped in fatigue, almost hunched over. Strangely, he didn't look like he could fight anything. He glanced absently at the cleaner at the end of the hallway, sweeping the floor. He wondered how many days he hadn't cleaned his house. At each other naively, having never seen anything like it before, and Ferguson opened the door. When they entered the room, Knox caught sight of his operator diagonally across the room door. The man was as dry as if all the water had been drained from his body. FBI agent Peter Andrew was lying on the floor. Blood from his throat covered the carpet. The man in the middle of the room was wearing the overalls used by cleaners. He had grabbed the blonde-haired operator by the back of his neck. A yellowish light danced around them both, leisurely like a gas flame. The blond young man raised his drying hand, just like the others, and weakly grabbed one of the computer's display cables and pulled. There was a small electrical explosion as the display fell to the floor, blowing the fuses in the line connected to the room. Ferguson ran toward the man with his back to him as the room was plunged into darkness. However, the man knelt in the dimly lit room and hissed, "Visha." The air rippled like a force field, hitting Ferguson and throwing the big man backwards like a feather pillow. In an instant, Ferguson was out the shuttered door and into the hallway. Knox had no such athletic ability, however, and with considerable speed, he drew his pistol and emptied the entire magazine into the big man's silhouette before him. The man raised his hand to cast another spell, but the first bullet pierced both his hand and his cheekbone, creating a neat hole in his skull. The second bullet entered through his nose, and the third just above his upper lip. The others entered from his throat to his diaphragm, knocking him to the ground. Ferguson stood up, cursing, and said, "What the F," as a bolt of lightning caught the big man for a few seconds and knocked him to the ground. Knox's eyes widened when he saw Ferguson struggling unconscious on the ground. Still, this did not stop the experienced analyst who had spent a lot of time on the battlefield. As he pulled the spare magazine from his jacket pocket and loaded his gun, he heard footsteps coming from the hallway. That wasn't all he heard. There was also a whispering sound. It wasn't the enemy he was expecting coming from the corner, but a sphere-shaped blue force field surrounding the enemy. In the center of the force field was the man who had just been sweeping the hallway. The thin, tall man in his 50s, with hair falling out in the middle, grinned with his yellow teeth. Knox hesitated for a moment, then pulled the trigger. As the birds hit the area surrounding the man, the energy fluctuated, the pentagonal pieces that made up the shield becoming clear in a light blue color. The man slowly raised his hand and smiled as Knox pulled the trigger of his gun one after another. The man's shield glowed but appeared to be unharmed. Suddenly, intense gunfire began to come from the other side of the hallway. The bullets that hit the shield sparked on the shield, ricocheting and shattering the floor, walls, and ceiling of the hallway they were flying through. But for a moment, Knox saw that the attack was working. The man's shield had turned from a solid blue to a light blue. At the same time, his attention had shifted from Knox, who had just finished firing his weapon, to the others in the hallway. Knox used this as an opportunity, stepping back, opening his drawer, and pulling out his last spare magazine. In the meantime, the first bullet had passed through the now depleted shield. However, the bullet exited the other side without touching the man. Knox loaded and cocked his weapon, and began firing again. The man screamed in pain as his shield shattered like glass with the fourth bullet and fell to the ground, shattered by bullets from both the corridor and the operations room. "The room is clear," Knox shouted with his combat experience and training. Frank's voice echoed from the hallway, "Hallway clear." "Frank!" Knox shouted. "Seal the block. Get back up and an ambulance," Knox added, running toward Ferguson as fast as his leg would allow. After Ferguson was taken to the hospital, Knox went back into the operations room. The floor was filled with emergency security personnel. The CIA's Chief of Homeland Security and Security had arrived, apparently speaking to the department director Gail Peterson and Broke Hall. Two forensic officers emerged from the room at that moment. Both of them had turned pale. Gail called Knox over as she saw Knox pass them. Knox looked at the two new operators at the computers and said, "All the computers are fried. Are you okay?" Knox just nodded. He was fine, very fine. The adrenaline had worn off and only the familiar smell of something frying and gunpowder remained in the air. Knox realized how much he had missed this. The desire and fear of death, the fighting and killing. Of course, he had kept it all to himself. "Peter Andrew?" Gail asked, looking at the blood on the carpet. "They cut his throat first," Knox said grimly, shaking his head. "Ferguson?" Gail said, cursing in an almost audible tone. Knox's face darkened. His heart stopped for a long time. The doctor said to pray. Gail noticed Knox's tension. She put her hand on his shoulder and asked, "Doctors always talk like that. Ferguson's been through something worse." What happened? Knox looked around and asked, "Do you want the truth, or should I make something up so I don't look crazy?" Frank the security guard said something like that. "Is that really a blue sphere?" Gale asked, laughing. "No cameras?" Knox asked, raising an eyebrow and squinting. "The circuits of the cameras were fried right before the attack," Gale said, pointing vaguely at a security camera in the corner. Knox nodded. "I see. Yes, there's a Blue Ranger orb. Although it broke after a lot of shooting, it's only lasted 2 or 3 magazines of 9mm ammunition. And Frank must have used up just as much ammunition." "This is unbelievable," Gale said, her eyes wide with astonishment. "Yeah, if we can't stop these guys the consequences will be truly dire," Knox grumbled, reaching into his pocket. Gale disagreed. Looking at the burning computers, she asked, "So what have we got?" "We've only lost a few hours," Knox said after a moment of thought. "It's nothing we can't recover if you give us more professionals, computers, and resources. Field agents, FBI, and SEAL Ops Prep. Homeland Security will be joining us tomorrow," Gail Peterson added. She had been calling nearly every department and agency since the beginning of this. "Oh great, them and Duke Perry," Knox said, shrugging. "Duke Perry? Duke Perry the reporter?" Gale asked, tilting her head slightly in curiosity. "Yes, that's him," Knox said, nodding. They hadn't had a chance to tell Gale about the reporter. "What does this have to do with it?" Gale asked curiously. Knox said, "When the FBI did their research on Polanov, I reached out to them. They contacted Duke. That's where that photo of Polanov came from. Perry is in Greece right now," and then added, "He probably found Polanov's training camp in Greece. So I hope it's his. I can't handle another terrorist group." "I thought the photo was from the FBI," Gale said, scratching her chin. Gail Peterson, who had read many of Duke Perry's articles and writings, said Duke was very dangerous because he was really unpredictable. The fact that the most dangerous man in the New York Times was involved made Gale nervous. Knox sensed the man's uneasiness, but he was in no position to care now. "Duke and the FBI agent have an unofficial information sharing agreement," he said, summarizing the previous events. "Ha, we were short a reporter," Gale grumbled. Knox shrugged. "Yeah, but he's ahead of us right now and he's doing a good job. He could give us the edge we need," he said, looking around the scattered operations room. No matter what anyone said, it looked like they needed every advantage they could get right now. August 3rd, Manhattan, New York, USA. Ernest Salzak was a tall, white-haired, thin man in his 40s. The blue-eyed, long-faced, serious-looking man, as always, picked up his boss MC Rollins from his mansion in his limousine and set off for next hour, as he had done every morning for 10 years. As Salzak left the mansion, he looked at the black Chrysler SUV, inside which were 2 men in suits and sunglasses. The limousine turned right and pulled onto the road, as always. Salzak, who was watching the rearview mirror, saw the large black car turn and follow them. Calmly, without taking his eyes off the left mirror, he said, "Jack, there's an SUV behind us." Jack was the bodyguard sitting in the front seat of the car. Jack Bluegate was not a big man like most bodyguards. He was 6'5" and weighed about 90 pounds. The athletic-looking man always wore gray, sleek suits. He had a dark brown mustache over his lips. This mustache always made him look 10 years older than he looked. The smiling man's dimpled chin and blue eyes made him more likable than handsome. The experienced bodyguard carefully checked behind him in his right mirror and through the camera mounted on the rear bumper. Following the route he normally took, Salzak went around the freeway and took the shortest route into Manhattan. The SUV behind them first left them more than 100 meters away, then the vehicle continued straight ahead at the next turn onto the highway and disappeared from sight. It was one of those quiet New York mornings. "You've become more of a worrywart as you've gotten older," Jack Bluegate said with a laugh. Ernest checked his surroundings through the mirrors and cameras, and sighed, "I guess so. They both laughed as they entered the Manhattan exit and began to move among the shadows of tall buildings. At this point, Ernest's eyes caught the garbage truck coming from the opposite lane. The old truck seemed to be coming a little too fast. As Ernest narrowed his eyes, the truck suddenly swerved into the left lane and stopped with a painful brake sound. The worker behind him got out of the vehicle with an AK-47 in his hand. The man in front pointed his gun at the car window and pulled the trigger, but the gun did not work. Jack suddenly had a gun in his hand and said harshly, "Back! Back!" The limousine started to back up, its tires emitting smoke. At this moment Ernest saw the minibus coming behind them. The minibus tried to block their way just like a garbage truck. MC Rollins was skidding around inside the car. As the limousine turned sharply, young people who had covered their faces with bandana masks and automatic weapons in their hands got out of the minibus. Sparks flew from the top of the car and the inside was filled with a noise like countless hammers hitting metal surfaces. Some of the windows cracked, froze but did not break. At this moment, MC Rollins, who was about to die of fear, was attracted by the man inside the car. The man was a magic user. The white-skinned, thin-faced man had black hair 3 or 4 fingers long and messy. The black-eyed man's thick eyebrows were so furrowed that his eyes were almost invisible. He had a blue fireball in his hand. The man, who was not wearing a mask like the others, got out of his vehicle and looked after the limousine while the car sped away from the ambush point at full speed. In response, the man simply broke the spell in his hand and looked after the car. The men next to the garbage truck came running to him. "My gun didn't work," one Hispanic man, out of breath, said angrily, while another said, "It's armored, the damn car is armored." The wizard, wearing black denim pants, black shoes, and a black hooded sweatshirt, looked at the weapon and spat on the ground. "It doesn't matter. We did our job, now let's get out of here," he said. After the failed assassination attempt, the McCrollins' house was filled with guards. 4 hours after the assassination, 6 black Dodge SUVs pulled into the street of the mansion. Bakesfield's car was behind the vehicles, which were driving close together and fast. The cars parked at the entrance to the mansion, while Bakesfield's limousine pulled in. A select group of mercenaries from Nisco Oil's bodyguard army emerged from the 6 SUVs and began to surround the house. They were all clad in Kevlar armor and carrying M4 rifles. Bakesfield got out of his car, saluted the guards at the door, and walked through the ornate front door. McCrollins was waiting for him on the steps of the house. Shaking the owner's hand, Bakesfield said quickly, "I picked the best guys in the city who could shoot a rifle. It's a very sad thing." McCrollins nodded, yes, and invited the man into the room. "Did you see the attackers?" Bakesfield asked sincerely. "Most of them were third-rate hooligans. But there was one wizard among them," said McCrollins, nodding. "I'm afraid he wasn't just a wizard," Bakesfield said haltingly, pulling his smartphone out of his jacket. "What do you mean?" McCrollins asked, frowning. Bakesfield held up a photo on his cell phone. "Our security guards rounded up your attackers in Queens about an hour ago. Was this guy one of them?" "Yeah, who's that?" McCrollins asked, looking at the photo intently. "The man's name is Albert Archibald. He is one of the black men stationed in Bordeaux, France," Bakesfield said. "One of us?" asked a surprised McMullins. "Unfortunately, yes," Bakesfield said. "But why?" asked McCrollins. "I understand we're dealing with a small gang of dissidents. Remember when I mentioned White Dagger?" Bakesfield asked the man. "Yeah, the fanatics," McCrollins said, putting his hand to his chin and nodding slightly. "Yeah, I guess you met some of them." "Fortunately, it was a small group," Bakesfield said, tilting his head. "Little?" McCrollins asked, raising an eyebrow. "Of course," Bakesfield said, then added, "they are both small and clumsy. You're still alive, thank goodness. But the annoying thing is, they know your daily routes, how many guards you have, where you stay, where you sleep. You shouldn't take that lightly. Besides, we have bigger problems, the cloak. Otto could be the leader of those White Daggers," he said. McCrollins found this funny and said in a sarcastic little voice, "Nonsense, Otto was the trainer of most of us." "Yes, and grandfather of the Destiny twins, Ian, and Sean," Bakesfield said, nodding. McCrollins raised his eyebrows in surprise and stammered, "What? How?" "He and his son had a falling out a long time ago. I thought it was just a simple disagreement. But his son fell in love with a wizard and married him. Before Otto could intervene, they both changed their names and ran away from America to London. They had twin sons who weren't identical in a small hospital," Bakesfield said with a sigh. "We found these in your room," he said, pulling out small, ladybug-sized discs from his pocket as McCrollins absent-mindedly smoothed back his hair. "Bugging devices?" McCrollins asked, frowning at the displays. "Yes, Albert Archibald specializes in explosives. He stole 3 kilograms of C4 from the safe house here. We still haven't found the C4. So we're sending you to the farm in Virginia," Bakesfield said firmly. "Don't be ridiculous, there's no need for that," McCrollins said, raising his hands in rejection. Bakesfield took the man by the shoulders and said, "You're the one who's not being ridiculous. If you die because of a few fanatic idiots, you'll jeopardize everything we've built up to this day. Do you know how many newspapers I've called all morning to tell them about the attempted attack? If you were to be assassinated like that, it would upset our stocks and start people asking questions." "I guess you're right," McCrollins said, biting his lower lip. August 3, Syria, Damascus. Duke mopped his sweaty forehead with a handkerchief, and huffed. Syria was much hotter than he remembered. Even the interior of Damascus International Airport was challenging, despite the coolers. The weathered concrete walls had once been painted a light gray, but that was long gone. The chaotic crowds, lined up by security guards and security lines, didn't seem to be too happy about it. The lights hanging from the 20-meter-high ceiling were on despite it being daylight, and the morning sunlight coming through the high window panes filled the hall with thick yellow beams. When the officer who was opening his suitcase asked, "Do you have any items you need to declare to customs?" Duke turned his attention back to the shiny metal table in front of him. "No, I just have a flask of whiskey and a few packs of Lucistrike for my personal use," Duke said, shaking his head with a smile. The customs officer looked at the reporter and said without expression, "As long as you don't drink the whiskey in the open, it won't be a problem, sir." "I'll be careful," Duke said with a smile. The man glanced at the water bottle and metal fountain pen in front of him and handed Duke his things back. Meeting Joanna in the empty space behind the customs checkpoint, Duke smiled and asked, "How did it go?" Joanna looked unhappy and tense. "The press card was very useful, but the woman at customs told me I would be arrested if I didn't show my cleavage. She also advised me to wear a headscarf," she said, shrugging. Joanna had her tight white shirt buttoned up. The buttons looked like they were going to pop off at the first opportunity. "Yeah, you need to cover your neck too," Duke said with a groan as he considered the implications. The woman sighed and shook her head. She really wanted to get out of this country quickly. The women glared at her with anger and jealousy, and the men looked at her as if they were going to eat her. This both frightened Joanna and amused her. "What are we doing?" she asked the Duke, who was looking around. "We'll check the names and locations of Eleni's friend, old Simitis. That many fugitives can't be running around Syria without being noticed," Duke said calmly, trying to find the airport exit. The airport exit was even more chaotic. People were struggling to find a car or shuttle to get to the city center. After struggling for 10 minutes to find a taxi, Perry and Joanna finally decided to rent a car. Duke loved renting a car in the Middle East. The rental prices were high and the fuel prices were very cheap. So he rented a Nissan Pathfinder with peace of mind. The man who opened the right door of the car welcomed Joanna, then closed the door and looked around as he passed by on the other side of the car. It seemed that the only people interested in her were men who had never seen a woman as attractive as Joanna before. When he got in the car, Duke saw that his cousin was calling him. "Hello," he answered the phone. The voice on the other end was still clear, though full of crackles and static. "Hello, Duke," said the cheerful voice of the fat banker. "Hey, cousin," Duke said as he buckled his seat belt, the phone between his chin and shoulder. The man on the other end asked, "Where are you?" Duke laughed, adjusted his seat and mirrors, and said, "You don't want to know about this." The man on the other end laughed too, and said, "Oh, I guess not," and added, "One of yours moved." Duke, who started the car, signaled left and asked, "Really, who?" "Otto," said the scratchy voice. "Where's Beauty?" Duke asked as he headed toward the inner city. "Turkey is a country in the Middle East," said the man across from him. "Oh, I know Turkey. Where is it?" Duke asked, smiling. "He last used his card in Izmir." "I see, thank you, cousin," Duke said, putting his phone in his pocket. "Who was it?" Joanna asked curiously. "My cousin," said Duke, "has been running some errands for me now and then. Nothing worthwhile has happened." "Where are we going now?" Joanna asked, overwhelmed by the heat and the scarf she was wrapped around herself. "Come on, Cham Palace Hotel," Duke said, pointing to the GPS in the car's console. "Where are the language settings on this thing?" Joanna asked, after fiddling with the GPS for a bit. Duke changed the language settings on his GPS from Arabic to English and then typed in Cham Palace Hotel using the touchscreen. He smiled. No matter what, it was good to get out of America and catch up on news again. He kept smiling until he caught sight of the numbers in the upper left corner of the route that appeared on the screen. When Duke's expression went blank, Joanna asked curiously, "What happened?" "I've seen numbers like that in George Starin's mail," Duke said seriously, without mentioning the emails he had been secretly sending himself. He tried to look at those emails on his smartphone. He sent the emails he found to Joanna. Joanna feverishly pulled her tablet out of her backpack, opened the email address, and said, 32.775729 to 35.25444, 34.444291 to 36.284409, 35.419272 to 36.429977, then realized where Duke was looking. The coordinates of the destination were listed in the upper left corner of the GPS screen. Latitude, 33.518894, longitude, 36.262237. Duke entered the first numbers Joanna said completely and without hesitation. When he saw the writing Eshkol Pond, Israel, both journalists looked at each other. "What was the other coordinate?" he said. Duke grinned. 34.444291 to 36.284409, Joanna said excitedly. It was as if they were on Treasure Island, searching for Flint's treasure. "Charbin, Lebanon. What's going on?" she asked, reading the location on her GPS out loud. "We'll see when we get to the hotel," Duke said with a smile. This was the first time they had found any tangible evidence in this story. As their car was leaving Damascus Airport, a BMW R1200 adventure motorcycle followed them. There were two people on the motorcycle. Even though Duke could see the motorcycle in his mirrors, he didn't think he was being followed. As they were leaving Damascus Airport, all they had seen was barren land. Although there had been some small-scale afforestation efforts on both sides of the highway, the green space was limited to this area. Although there were occasional fancy mansions, the barren land generally turned green as they approached the center of Damascus. After a while, the number of buildings gradually increased, and they were immersed in the city's sea of concrete. The irregular reinforced concrete construction caused Duke to feel an inexplicable sense of relief. The capital of Syria, Damascus, has been known throughout world history as the city that has been used continuously for the longest time. The city, which was occupied by the Ottoman Empire in 1516 and the French in 1920, suffered the greatest destruction, but its greatest disaster was experienced in the civil war supported by its northern neighbor, Turkey. In this war, it lost control of its lands in the north. ISIS and the Kurds fought for the oil resources in the north. Russia supported the state forces, Turkey secretly provided weapons and resources to ISIS, and the Kurds received support from America and European countries. The war got increasingly dirty, and eventually, more than 20 million Syrians were forced to leave their homes. Some returned after the war ended, while others were exploited as slaves in Turkey, where they migrated, and were able to escape to Europe. Some met the cruel faces of Europeans on these migration routes, and were either sent back to their countries or left to die. The city, which had experienced the darkest days of its civilized and bright era, was only just beginning to recover. Duke and Joanna, who crossed the border from Syria to Lebanon at dawn, managed to get quite close to where they found on the GPS before the heat reached a striking level. Lebanon was an Arab and Middle Eastern country located west of Syria, on the coast of the eastern Mediterranean. Its capital was Beirut. Duke had stayed in Beirut for 2 years. The homeland of the Phoenician civilization in history was Lebanon and its coasts. Syria was in the north and east of these lands, which were full of history, and Israel was in the south. The national and official language of such a small, besieged country was Arabic. Despite being a state with a mixed religious structure, Lebanon was one of the most organized and well-off countries in the Middle East, with the establishment of the political balance required by the social structure. However, this envied stability began to deteriorate with the increase in the number of Palestinians coming to Lebanon as a result of the Arab-Israeli conflict. When Muslims became the majority in number at the end of the 70s, they began to struggle to have as much say in the administration as Christians, and the struggle turned into a civil war in 1975. Afterwards, Lebanon never recovered. Duke, who was taking the main road towards the capital, then turned north, passing through the town of Emra El Asi and entering the mountainous terrain. The Nissan Pathfinder, who was speeding along the well-paved road, slowed down when he saw the high concrete walls in front of him. The walls, at least 4 meters high, blocked the road in both directions as far as the eye could see. In front of the wall was a large metal gate, and in front of it was a checkpoint with concrete railings crossing it. Duke slowed his car down, cursing through his teeth. "Is it an American base?" Joanna asked, looking a little timidly at the guards and the checkpoint from behind her sunglasses. Duke glanced at a sign that was easier to read as he got closer, and grumbled, "Unfortunately not." The large sign next to the checkpoint read Worknex Construction Site. The man at the Worknex entrance was quite large. At nearly 6 feet tall, it was obvious that he had spent several years in bodybuilding. His broad shoulders had arms that were almost as wide as an adult's legs. His Hank G33 strapped across his chest looked like a toy. The tanned man in desert camouflage was American. Duke could see him clearly through the mirrored sunglasses that covered his eyes. The big man, whose mustache extended down to the sides of his jaw, grinned with gold canines. "You've come a long way from New York, sir, but you can't enter the Worknex Charbine facility," he said, while there were 4 other Lebanese private security guards at the entrance. "Really? Why?" Duke asked, smiling. He knew he wouldn't be able to get in anyway, but that didn't matter. If he was lucky, he could get twice as much information from the guard as he could from a facility manager. "This is a commercial facility, and we don't allow unauthorized intruders," the guard said, as casually as if he'd just taken a class in good human relations. "Commercial in what?" Duke asked again with curiosity, and from the man's approach he realized that he wasn't as lucky as he thought. The man tilted his head, shook it from side to side, and smiling, his lips curled regretfully, "I'm sorry, I'm not authorized to speak on this matter." The big man's expression was unexpectedly gentle. Duke realized he wouldn't be able to get any information from the friendly man. Deciding to change strategy, he asked, "So who can we get information from?" "Worknex General Management, Press Relations Department can contact you, Mr. Perry," the man said. "I see, so my boss, you won't let us in until I call your boss." "I think so, sir," said the man. Perry turned his car around and headed back the way he had come, returning to his cabin to inform his chief of staff, when 2 bikers lying down in the bushes next to the road watched them. End of chapter 5. Hello, if you liked my story, don't forget to like, comment, share. This story belongs to Onur Diler's Tales of the Forbidden City concept. In this concept, there is a timeline and all the stories are connected to it.